I never thought a broken laptop could change the course of my day, or maybe, in some quiet, impossible way, my life. I was hunched over the counter at the little repair shop tucked between a shuttered cafe and a dry cleaner, my hands buried in tangled cords, when she walked in. She moved like someone who owned the air around her without even trying. Not in a flashy, attention-grabbing way, but the sort of presence that made the room notice, even if it didn't want to. Mid-40s, maybe older, with sharp eyes that seemed to weigh everything in a glance and a half-smile that hinted at knowing something I didn't. Confidence radiated from her like sunlight through dusty blinds. Yet there was softness in the way she tucked her hair behind her ear as she studied the counter. I froze. That's the honest truth. My fingers lingered over a screwdriver, trembling just enough to make a tiny metallic click against the tabletop. She looked down at the laptop I was supposed to fix, tilting her head slightly, and there it was, the first flicker of something. "Is it bad?" she asked, voice calm, not condescending. Maybe," I muttered, immediately hating how stupid I sounded. She didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes. She just nodded, like she understood. And that simple acknowledgement, a small, quiet recognition, felt electric. I tried to focus on my work, telling myself she was just another customer. But every so often, I caught her watching. Not in a way that made me self-conscious exactly. More like she was cataloging every micro-movement, every hesitation, every little twitch of my hands. And when our eyes met, it wasn't a look of judgment. It was something warmer, something fragile that seemed to tremble at the edge of acknowledgement. She reached over to push a stray wire back onto the counter, and our fingers brushed for a second that stretched too long. Not enough to be romantic, maybe, but enough to make me aware of how alive my palms suddenly felt. I tried to shrug it off, but my throat tightened anyway. Her confidence didn't intimidate me. It invited me in, but carefully, like offering a hand to someone standing too close to a cliff. I noticed the faint smell of her perfume, not overpowering, just enough to linger behind her like a memory I hadn't yet earned. Then, almost abruptly, she turned to leave. I blinked, and in that single moment, something odd settled in my chest. It wasn't desire, exactly, not yet. It was curiosity, sharp and insistent, like a puzzle piece I didn't realize I was missing. I wanted to ask her name, something banal like that, and yet the thought alone felt heavy with meaning. I watched her pause at the door, one hand on the frame, glancing back over her shoulder. Our eyes met again. A flicker, a pause, and then she was gone, leaving behind a faint echo of the moment, and me staring at the counter, half expecting her to step back through the door. I found myself running my fingers over the counter where hers had touched, thinking, inexplicably, that the smallest brush of skin could hold an entire conversation. And even now, hours later, I can't stop replaying that glance, that hesitation, that impossible flicker of connection. Something unspoken started there, between a half-broken laptop and a quiet shop, and I'm not sure either of us will ever forget it. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. Yet there she was, leaning slightly against the counter with that same quiet poise, like she belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. The repair shop smelled faintly of solder and coffee, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead made the silence between us feel almost weighted. "Thanks for helping me last time," she said, barely meeting my eyes. The words were polite, but there was something behind them, something careful, as if she were testing a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. I nodded, fumbling slightly with the screwdriver I'd picked up out of habit. "No problem. Figured you'd come back sooner or later." She smiled, just a hint, and it was gone before it fully reached her eyes. That smile, it tugged at me, because it wasn't meant to charm anyone. It was small, private, and almost sad in a way I didn't understand. As I worked on the laptop, I noticed the way her hands rested on the edge of the counter, fingers brushing against the worn wood, as though grounding herself. There was a faint tremor in one hand. Not much, but enough to make me pause. I wanted to ask if she was tired, if she needed a break, but the words didn't come out. Instead, I offered her a coffee from the machine behind me. She shook her head lightly, refusing, yet her eyes lingered on the cup, and I saw the faint crease in her brow, the hint of a sigh she didn't let escape. She watched me quietly as I worked, and I could feel her eyes on me, measuring, calculating, but not unkindly. It was like trying to read a book written in a language only I knew existed, but couldn't quite translate. I noticed the way her shoulders curved slightly forward, like she was carrying something heavy, and the faint shadow under her eyes made me pause mid-screwdriver turn. "You've got steady hands," she said finally, voice low, hesitant, as if admitting something personal. I glanced up, surprised. "Thanks," I muttered, unsure why my chest felt tight at the sound of her voice saying something that simple. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that starts in the chest and stops before it reaches the lips. Fragile, careful, like she didn't want anyone to catch it fully. I wanted to hear it again. I wanted to know what it meant, who it was for. And then, in a quiet instant that stretched far too long, she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and our hands nearly touched as I passed her the laptop to check a detail. The brush of fingers wasn't enough to be accidental, not really. It lingered in that charged, almost forbidden space between us, heavy with meaning neither of us spoke aloud. She caught my gaze and held it just long enough to make my chest pound, then turned away with a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She wasn't smiling anymore, not really, but there was something in her retreat, a hesitation, a soft pull, that made me realize she wasn't entirely untouchable. She was careful. She was distant. And yet, she let me in, just a little. As she left, I stood there, tracing the faint imprint of where her fingers had brushed against mine, wondering if she felt it too. The air between us hummed in quiet intensity, and I realized I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. The slight pull, the careful hesitation, the forbidden energy that neither of us had named but both of us recognized. The storm hit just as she arrived, rain hammering against the small cafe window where we had been working side by side, quietly organizing invoices and receipts. The fluorescent lights above made the room feel smaller, warmer, almost intimate, and I could sense every subtle movement she made. The way she adjusted her scarf, the slight tap of her fingers on the table, the soft exhale that betrayed how tired she was. We had been here for hours, neither of us saying much beyond what was necessary. The quiet had grown comfortable in its own strange way, a tension that was neither fully frightening nor entirely welcome. "Do you ever feel like things are just stuck?" she asked suddenly, voice low, almost lost in the hum of the cafe fridge. I looked up, startled. Her eyes didn't meet mine directly. They hovered somewhere above, as if weighing words she didn't trust herself to speak. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth refused, leaving me with only a nod and the faintest shrug. She sighed, brushing a hand over her forehead, and I noticed the faint tremble in her fingers, the way her shoulders curved inward as if she were carrying a secret too heavy to set down. I wanted to reach out, to tell her it was okay, but something inside me held me back. Maybe fear, maybe respect, maybe both. For a moment, our knees brushed under the table. I felt the shock of proximity, a spark that went unspoken. I tried to focus on the paperwork in front of me, pretending it required more concentration than it did. My heart raced, and I could tell she felt it too. She didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either. The sudden buzz of her phone broke the tension like a lightning strike. She glanced at the screen, and I glimpsed a name I recognized from an old conversation. A former flame, or maybe just someone she owed explanations to. Her hand hovered over the phone for a moment before she silenced it and shoved it back into her bag with a subtle, tight-lipped grimace. I wanted to ask, to probe, to lean in and say, "Tell me." But I didn't. The storm outside rattled the windows, and her hair fell over her face as she bent down to organize the papers. The air between us was heavy, taut with the things we didn't say. Then it happened, the almost moment. I reached instinctively to pass her a pen, our fingers brushing lightly in a way that made my stomach flip. Her eyes flicked up, meeting mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I saw it there. Hesitation, curiosity, something almost tender. My hand froze mid-motion, as if the world itself had decided we weren't ready. She cleared her throat and looked away, suddenly busy with a stack of invoices that didn't really need stacking. The spell broke, and I sat there, my palm tingling where hers had touched mine, my mind replaying the near confession we hadn't made, the closeness that hovered just out of reach. By the time the rain stopped, she was gone, leaving me staring at the empty chair and the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I could still feel the brush of her fingers, the almost whisper of connection, and I knew I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about it. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. We were alone in the bookstore that evening, the one with narrow aisles and the faint smell of old paper and polish. Most of the customers had long since left, leaving only the soft hum of the overhead lights and the occasional creak of the floorboards under our steps. I was stacking returned books, pretending that organization was urgent. She lingered near the poetry section, flipping through the pages of a worn collection, her fingers brushing lightly over the lines as if trying to memorize the rhythm of someone else's life. I caught her glance a few times, each one loaded, unspoken. Finally, she closed the book with a soft snap, and the quiet between us grew impossible. She didn't ask me to look at her. She didn't ask me anything at all. But the air itself seemed to demand honesty. "What are we doing?" she asked finally, voice low, almost a whisper, but cutting straight through the pretense. I froze, unsure whether to answer, unsure whether there was an answer at all. She was looking at me, not really at me, but through me, as if searching for a truth she didn't yet want to name. "I don't know," I admitted, almost ashamed at the simplicity of it. My hands were trembling, though I pressed them against the stack of books to hide it. She let out a soft laugh, hollow, like the sound had no place in the room. "Of course you don't," she said, and there was no anger in it, just a tired, vulnerable honesty that left me off balance. We stood there, inches apart, neither moving. The silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It was raw, stretching between us like a fault line. I noticed the subtle weight in her posture, the tiny slump in her shoulders, the faint shadow under her eyes that made her seem smaller than she usually did. I wanted to reach out, to brush a loose strand of hair behind her ear, to say something foolish and human, but the words refused. She glanced at me again, and in that gaze I saw everything we were trying to avoid: curiosity, longing, restraint, and a hint of fear. I wanted to tell her how much I noticed her, how tired she looked, how carefully she measured every movement, how much I wanted to lean into her silence and stay there. But the truth felt dangerous, almost reckless. "I feel like we're pretending," she whispered finally, more to herself than to me. "Pretending this is normal, that nothing's happening." I swallowed hard. She wasn't wrong. Every stolen glance, every brush of fingers, every quiet hour spent together had been pretending, but neither of us could continue the illusion any longer. The space between us vibrated with everything we hadn't said. I could feel the pull, the weight of potential, the tension in the unspoken. My chest ached, my fingers itched to bridge the gap, but the silence demanded more than touch. It demanded honesty, even if it hurt. And then she said it, finally, devastatingly, a confession to the empty bookstore more than to me. "I think I'm too scared to let you in, but I can't stop thinking about it." Her words hung there, trembling in the still air, and I realized that neither of us could go back to normal. The room felt smaller, the light harsher, the quiet unbearable, and yet, impossibly, electric. The small art gallery smelled faintly of turpentine and polished wood, the kind of place that felt empty, yet somehow intimate, as if the walls themselves were listening. She was crouched near a painting, brushing invisible dust from the frame, and I couldn't help but notice how careful she was, not just with the art, but with herself, with every movement. "Do you ever," she began hesitantly, not looking at me, "regret letting someone go?" I paused mid-step, unsure how to answer. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight, a subtle tremor that made my stomach twist. She didn't meet my eyes. Instead, she stared at the floor, picking at the edge of her coat. "I don't know," I said slowly, wishing I could say something more meaningful. "I guess sometimes." Her laugh was soft, a little bitter. "Sometimes? You make it sound easy." I wanted to reach out, but stopped myself, respecting the invisible distance she'd set. Yet, the way she held herself, slightly slumped shoulders, the quiet pull of her hands toward herself, told me everything she wasn't saying. Then she did something unexpected. From the pocket of her bag, she pulled a small, worn envelope and held it out to me. I took it cautiously, the paper thin and creased. Her hands shook slightly, though she tried to hide it behind her back. "It's from someone I lost a long time ago," she murmured. Her voice faltered, a rare crack in the armor she wore so effortlessly. "I never sent it. Never could." I looked down at the envelope, then back at her. Her eyes glistened under the gallery lights, not with tears, but with memory and quiet ache. I didn't know what to say. Words felt trivial, inadequate, impossible. "I remember him sometimes," she continued softly. "More than I probably should." She swallowed, the movement almost imperceptible, but enough for me to notice. I said nothing, just let her hold that space, because anything I could say would have broken the fragile honesty she'd laid out. My chest tightened as I realized how human, how painfully human, she was. Not untouchable, not perfectly composed. Just her, carrying past hurt with a grace that made the room feel smaller and my own thoughts louder. I wanted to tell her that the small laugh she'd given me in the repair shop reminded me of someone she might have loved or lost. That seeing her hands, slightly trembling, made me ache with recognition of what she'd carried alone. But the words stuck in my throat. We stood there, quiet, and for a moment, the gallery faded around us. The hum of lights, the faint echo of footsteps from the street outside, even the paintings on the wall, all of it became background to the simple, human truth she'd exposed. Grief, memory, and a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. And then, just as she began to tuck the envelope back into her bag, her hand brushed mine. Not fully, not deliberately, but enough to make the world shift slightly on its axis. I felt it. The air between us changed. Charged, fragile, trembling. And I knew, in a way I couldn't name yet, that nothing would feel the same after this small, seismic moment. Her eyes met mine for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. She didn't say anything, but I could feel the confession lingering in the space between us, and somehow, that was enough. The cafe was nearly empty that evening, just a few lingering patrons and the soft hiss of the espresso machine. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the streets glistening under the amber glow of the streetlights. We found a quiet corner, 2 chairs pulled close, though not too close, just enough that the space between us felt intentional. She stirred her coffee slowly, eyes distant for a moment, as if thinking about everything she hadn't said over the past weeks. I watched her, noticing the small details I had come to memorize. The way her fingers wrapped around the cup, the subtle lift of her brows when something amused her quietly, the tired curve at the edges of her lips that hinted at too many sleepless nights. "I don't want to pretend anymore," she said softly, almost a murmur. No flash of drama, no tearful confession, just a simple, human admission. I nodded, heart thudding, though I said nothing. Sometimes words felt too large, too clumsy for the quiet honesty between us. Instead, I leaned back slightly, letting my presence fill the space, letting her see that I understood without having to speak it aloud. She glanced at me, and for a moment, the world outside, the rain-soaked streets, the distant traffic, the other customers, disappeared. All that mattered was the subtle shift in how we occupied the same space, careful but unspoken, deliberate but effortless. I reached out, almost instinctively, letting my hand hover over hers. She didn't pull away. Her fingers moved just enough to brush mine, a feather-like contact that made everything else fall away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't planned. But it was real, and it was enough. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly, and the words carried a weight neither of us needed to unpack. I felt the same, though I didn't say it. Our understanding didn't require verbal permission. It had been building in stolen glances, near touches, and long silences for weeks. We sat together, shoulder to shoulder, letting the quiet fill the air. Sometimes she sipped her coffee, sometimes I ran my fingers over the rim of my cup, but mostly we just existed in that space, the hum of the cafe around us fading into background music. Her hand shifted slightly, letting our fingers intertwine for just a moment longer. The touch wasn't rushed or urgent. It was a decision, a promise made silently, acknowledging what had always been there, but never named. I felt a weight lift inside me, a slow, steady release of tension I hadn't realized I'd carried. She exhaled too, and I could see the relief in the tilt of her head, the softening of her shoulders. No grand declarations, no fiery confessions, just presence, acknowledgement, and a mutual recognition that we had found something inevitable, fragile, and entirely ours. And as we sat there, letting the quiet stretch between us without needing to define it, I realized that some moments didn't need words to be complete. I let my forehead lean just slightly toward hers, a simple, intimate gesture, and she responded with the faintest smile, eyes closing for a brief instant. It wasn't a climax. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and somehow that was enough. Looking back now, it feels strange to remember how small things once carried such weight. The brush of a hand, a half-spoken thought, a glance that lingered just a second too long. Sitting here in my apartment, the rain tapping gently against the window, I can still feel that quiet pull between us, like a current I never wanted to fight. She's changed me in ways I didn't realize at the time. I notice patience I didn't have before, the way I observe people and moments, waiting to understand rather than rushing to respond. And her, well, she's allowed herself small openings, moments of softness I'd only glimpsed before. There's still a carefulness to her, but it's paired now with a quiet trust that wasn't there at the beginning. We didn't need grand declarations. We didn't need perfection. What we built, slowly, painfully, was something far rarer, understanding. A connection that doesn't need to shout to exist, that can live in a shared glance, a subtle smile, or a hand brushing another across a table. Love, it seems, can be quiet and unassuming, yet impossible to ignore once it's rooted itself inside you. I catch myself replaying certain evenings, the bookstore, the gallery, the cafe, remembering her laugh, the way her eyes flickered when she hesitated, and the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands when she allowed herself to be seen. Each memory is a thread woven into the fabric of who we've become together, even without saying, "I love you" out loud. And yet, even with the past behind us, there's a softness in the unspoken. We've learned that closeness doesn't always mean possession, that intimacy isn't about perfection, and that sometimes the most profound moments are measured in seconds and silences rather than grand gestures. I still think about her sometimes when I least expect it. The way she tilts her head when she's thinking, the faint crease between her brows, the quiet steadiness of her presence. It lingers, as it always has. And I realize that this, all of it, is enough. We didn't need fireworks. We didn't need a storybook ending. We just needed each other's honesty, patience, and subtle courage. And somehow, that small, human truth is the most beautiful thing I've ever known. So here I am, reflecting, smiling quietly at the thought that slow, careful love can be the kind that endures. That even the smallest gestures, a touch, a shared silence, a look, can reshape lives in ways words never could. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this? Because sometimes, the quietest moments are the ones that stick with us the longest.